Week 31. Week 31. Can you believe it? July 30th through August 5th. Going through the 1-year Bible in a year. And I'm just hitting the highlights for you in a podcast as short as possible. 2 Chronicles 26 through Ezra 2. Romans 13 through 1 Corinthians 2:5. Psalms we've already done, but you can continue going through the 1-year Bible, and Proverbs 20 verses 11 through 23. I'm Jerry Rothhauser. Spiritualrants.com will give you a lot more information, but I'm trying to shrink it up as much as I can to help you, maybe on your ride to work in the morning. All right, here we go. 2 Chronicles. You've already covered most of the kings here, the bad kings, the good kings. There aren't many. Hezekiah, Josiah, and Jehoshaphat, jumping or otherwise. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, Manasseh in chapter 33 was about as bad as they got. As bad as Ahab. Remember, Ahab was the namesake for the evil guy in Moby Dick. That's where that comes from. Manasseh was a creepinski to the highest degree, and he even passed his children through the flames of idolatry, like literally. So I don't know if he singed them or completely burnt them up. We don't know. That's how bad. And all of the bad ones, even some of the good ones, had put up monuments and worship places in the high places up in the hills. So Manasseh was no exception, and some of that was for astrology. Anyway, he got carried into captivity and repented, prayed, and God listened to his prayer. You may think you have committed some of the worst sins ever and that God must hate you. But not true. Manasseh was freed and allowed to go back to Israel, but the writing was on the wall. That comes from Daniel. We'll get there eventually, that figure of speech. But the southern kingdom should have wised up once their king was taken into captivity and then released again. The northern kingdom had already pretty much have been taken into captivity to Assyria, and the southern kingdom will be going into captivity to Babylonia. Now we're going to meet a guy in Ezra named Cyrus. And after 70 years, and when you study the scripture a little more deeply, but you're just going through for the first time, take my word for it, 70 years of captivity is a very important concept when we get into this portion of Scripture. Anyway, after 70 years of captivity, this all happens in like the 6th century BC, when the 70 years occurs, when Israel goes into captivity and then is allowed to go back to Israel. That's 70 years. We don't hear much about that. But in Ezra, verse 1 of chapter 1, there's a decree from Cyrus, who was king of the world. So we had Assyria, we had Babylonia, then we have Persia. So Babylonia is like present-day Iraq, Persia, Iran, and Assyria was all in that area. So Ezra had written not only Ezra, but Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, and Psalm 119, the largest chapter in the Bible, all penned by Ezra. Cyrus had been mentioned by name. This is like mind-blowing. In Isaiah 44, verse 28, and 45, verse 1, 200 years before he was born, Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus would come to reign. And then, since he was king of the world, he was able to let the Israelites go back to Israel, and they did. Whoever wanted to, they didn't have to, they weren't commanded, but actually Cyrus was commanded by God to do what he did. He was appointed by God to be king of the world. And so 50,000 of the Israelites went back to Israel with Zerubbabel to the rubble of what was left of Israel back then. 2,000 returned with Ezra. Later on, we find out in the book. So you could divide it up as chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 10. Anything else you may want to know, and you will, Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, we'll get to them, but that fits in with this period under Ezra. Don't mispronounce Haggai like I almost did. It's not Haggai, it's Haggai. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther all go together. All right, we'll talk more about that. Getting into the New Testament, Romans 13 talks about the government. There's a verse in there that says that the government is a minister of the Lord. Can you believe that? So your policemen, mayors, governors, president are ministers of the Lord. And verse 4 is really interesting, says that it does not bear the sword for nothing. In other words, nations have permission from God to wage war, especially when it's in God's will. So, when anyone's fighting for our country, they're not committing murder. They are essentially doing God's will when we're involved in a just war, of course. Anyway, so read that. And then in chapters 14, 15, and 16, closing out Romans, as I pointed out to you, Paul's letters usually start with theology, and the ending chapters are application. No exception from 12 through 16 is application in Romans. But chapter 14 is the concept that we should be Christocentric. In other words, we should be centered on Christ. And if you want to know what joy is, chapter 4 is centering on Jesus. So Jesus first. Chapter 15 says others should be put second, J-O, and then Y, yourself, last. That would be chapter 16 in Romans, J-O-Y. 14, Jesus first. 15, others second. And yourself last, chapter 16. And may I guide you to a song. Johnny McClung at Twitter. That's where you will find this song. And I think it outlines what joy is, J-O-Y. And you can find the song, which I guess is based on Psalm 33, but it could have been Romans 14, 15, 16. Johnny McClung on Twitter, JOHNNYMCCLUNG. 1 Corinthians is a letter written to the worst church ever in history, in Corinth. So Paul's dealing with Gentiles who are steeped in Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle and Socrates. Yeah, believe me. Okay, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In Corinth, they were unbelievably messed up, which was good news for us, bad news for them, but we're going to learn a lot from them. But we're only reading through chapter 2 this week. There is a church in Corinth, Greece, and it says they have been sanctified. As messed up they were, they had already, in God's view, been made holy. We'll talk more about that. Memorize verse 25 of 1 Corinthians and 31, and then verse 2 in chapter 2. After I was saved, one project I undertook was to memorize a verse out of every chapter in the New Testament. And I pretty much was able to do that. And that'd be a good project for yourself, of course, but at least note those scriptures. And you're done for the week. Next week, chapter 32. I was trying to get done in 5 minutes, but it looks like we're going to make it under 12 minutes. Jerry Rothhauser, spiritualrants.com. And I hope you'll be listening again next week for week 32.